Hi boys and girls, welcome back to the land of low friction. So today we're going to be going through, super exciting, cost to run modelling. Who doesn't want to talk about numbers and dollars and figures? So one of the big focuses for zero friction cycling, especially as the testing has continued on, is much more focused on, really what products are delivering the lowest wear rates and therefore going to be delivering the lowest cost to run for your group set. Much more so as opposed to really what lubricant is 3 watts or 3.2 watts or 3.5 watts. So there's a pretty sort of tight blanket in terms of the outright efficiency testing results that we see from a place that can actually efficiency test properly like Ceramic Speed, versus we see across MyTest, which runs for thousands of kilometers and has contamination, so dry contamination blocks and wet contamination, which is really putting the lubricants through its paces, much more so than just a clean lab test. And the wear rates that we see of the chain, which are then going to directly correlate to the wear rates that are going to go through your components, we can see that, obviously that is then going to multiply out in what bits you have to buy and how often you have to buy them and how expensive those parts are. So over time I've been just working on refining. I've still got some refining to do, and there's a big next step of this particular area that I'll be trying to get up and going if I can over the next months. But we're at a stage now where I've sort of got it presentable enough where we've got the data tables there which show what the cost to run is for particular lubricants on particular group sets based on the wear rates attained through the main test block of the zero friction cycling testing. So, the difference is obviously pretty stark between the top lubricants that we found versus, even the middle to the worst lubricants can be really, really poor. And what's really, I guess, important to note is that overall, for most group sets, so unless you're running something super cheap, like an 8-speed Sunrace or, Tiagra, for most group sets, overall, by far the dominant cost to run per 10,000 kilometers of cycling is the component wear, not the cost of the lubricant. So this really comes into play a lot when sometimes somebody's weighing up, do I spend that $55 on a bottle of X or do I spend $15 on a bottle of Rock and Roll Gold? A few things do come into play. Obviously there is, how long does the lubricant treatment last, and how much you need to put on per treatment. So sometimes the cheaper lubricant, just in lubricant cost, can actually work out more versus the more expensive that may last longer and need less applied each time. But really by far the dominant cost is what is the wear rate delivered to your drivetrain from running that lubricant choice. So it's really important for obviously pretty much any sort of cyclist, but it becomes even more important making the right lubricant choice if you're riding in off-road conditions, and so when we see the data tables on that should really start to become quite clear. But also obviously it being the case that your component wear is by far the dominant cost of the cost to run overall for your lubrication. The more expensive your drivetrain, so the higher the tier your group set, then that just becomes more and more dominant. So once you start moving from say 105 to say Dura Ace or Campy Record, Axis Road, Eagle XX1 or X01, your lubricant costs, with very few exceptions, your lubricant cost is really almost inconsequential versus what the wear rate is for that lubricant for your group set. So that is by far the thing you need to look at. And so looking at, and I guess this is why I've got the cost to run modelling there, and why I'm going to be trying to improve on the way that it's displayed on the website. And what the next step is that I want to be able to, rather than me just display the modelling, which we'll go through soon, sort of by component and by sort of cycling type. Because your group set, I can only cover so many. I've really only sort of covering a few group set types and a few cycling types, because it just becomes data table after data table. I want to get to the stage where, especially if yours is not one displayed, that you can enter your group set. You'll have to sort of enter the cost because obviously they change, and your riding type and then it's going to display the cost to run for the lubricants. They'll all come up and you can see which is the right or the best sort of option for you. So that's going to be a part 2, but just to sort of get that sort of automated system going, it would take just a little bit more work time. So we've just got basic table at the moment. So, all right, we're going to, we'll move to displaying the first data table. And so that is going to, this is showing the cost to run for Ultegra 11 speed based on the wear rates for the test blocks 1 to 5. So test blocks 1 to 5 include 3 clean test blocks and 2 contamination test blocks. So the dry contamination and the wet contamination test blocks. So the main display here is sort of really showing the cost to run really based across a pretty wide range of cycling. So this is sort of just the main data extrapolation. So those first 5 blocks cover 5,000 kilometres of testing. So we're taking the wear rates attained from those from that 5,000 kilometres of testing. From the chain wear rate that we've attained, so we basically know fairly well if we're running sort of Ultegra, we basically know if we replace a chain at 0.5% that we're going to get 2 chains through our cassette. And we know that if we replace our chains by 0.5% that we're going to be able to get, we should be getting basically, I work off 6. You might only maybe sometimes get 4, but I'm working off 6 chains to a set of chain rings because for the top lubricants that should be pretty much what you're going to get. So based on working on 2 chains to a cassette and 6 chains to a set of chain rings, from the amount of lubricant used, the lubricant cost, the chain wear, the subsequent cassette wear from that, so factoring 2 chains per cassette, and the chain ring wear, factoring 6 chains per set of chain rings, and the cost of those components, I can then step out what that cost to run is per 10,000 kilometres. So basically I'm just doubling what I've got for the 5,000 kilometres. And so we can see at the top, so delivering the lowest cost to run per 10,000 kilometres is M-Speed Wax and then Silca Hot Melt. So the 2 immersive waxes are taking, or the 2 top immersive waxes that we tested take the 2 top spots. New kid on the block, Effetto Mariposa Flower Power Wax is taking the next spot. And then Ceramic Speed UFO Drip, Silca Synergetic, Rex Black Diamond, SS Drip. So now basically all of those, if we have a look at the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so the top 7, all of those really you would pretty much class those as pretty expensive lubricants, you know, to purchase. So a bottle of UFO Drip is like 55. Same with Synergetic. Same with SS Drip. Same with Black Diamond. Flower Power's cheaper at I believe that's going to be $29.90. The immersive waxes aren't that cheap per sort of 500 grams. So the lubricant cost themselves is actually not, you know, super cheap bottle. A lot of people don't like to pay 55 or more for a bottle of lubricant, but we can see that it's paying you back. So when we look further down the table, so if we look at, say, towards the bottom, so at the bottom we've got the, as we sort of went through with the muck-off files part 2, so we've got pretty much the highest wear rate lubricants ever tested there in the 3 muck-offs. You know, we're looking at, you know, what are we, 8 times or more the wear rate versus the top immersive waxes, and sort of even 6 times or more versus the next. So that is just so much more cost to run. And even in the middle of the table, you know, we're sort of looking at figures that are sort of getting double to triple those in the top third of the table. So there's a pretty significant difference there, and that is just talking Ultegra. And you can see in the columns where we're breaking down, so everything's really broken down to get to that number. So we've got the cost of the lubricant. So that the lubricant cost display there is not the cost of a bottle of that lubricant. That is the cost of the lubricant used during the testing. So how much did I use to get through the 5,000 kilometres of testing, and then double it. And the number of chains, so what was the chain wear, so how many chains did we physically wear through in this 10,000 kilometre period, what that would cost you, how much cassette wear that correlates to, and how much the cassettes cost you, how much chainring wear would have occurred, and how much is that costing you. So it's all broken down and then we get the total. We'll move to the next data table now, which is basically exactly the same. We're just replacing Ultegra to Dura-Ace. So a couple of things changed. So number one is obviously the cost of the components is a lot higher. But also we know that from pretty much good experience that most times, not always, but most times, most people are only getting one chain to a Dura-Ace cassette unless they're running two chains in rotation. And the reason is that Dura-Ace cassettes are just really soft. Well, at least the largest 6 cogs are. They're made of a titanium alloy, and that just wears so much faster and easier than the steel cogs. And so even running a top lubricant and replacing the chain at 0.5, it can happen, unfortunately, all too often that you still need a new cassette with a new chain. You may get lucky, but I've factored in that you will likely need that new cassette. So this time we're using 1 cassette per chain as opposed to 2. And obviously we've got a higher cassette cost and chain rings cost. And so we can see that for basically all the lubricants, so if you were to flick back to the first page, so for most lubricants, it's not been a doubling of the cost to run. It's been a lot more than that because the components are a lot more expensive. And in one in particular, the one part is faster wearing. So the cost of the components becomes a much more dominant part of the cost to run as opposed to the lubricant cost. So the lubricant cost really starts to become a very minor percentage of the total cost to run per 10,000 kilometres. And again, we can see some really big figures in cost to run for lubricants that simply tested to have quite a high wear rate as opposed to lubricants that remained very low wear rate throughout the main test. And so this is where we can have a last little quick look at how big and scary some of those figures can be down towards the bottom of the total cost table as opposed to, say, the first 5 or 7. And then so have a think that if you're we all have, I guess, a discretionary spend on our cycling. Cycling costs money to do. You got to buy stuff all the time. So some do it, I guess, at a better budget than others. But any household, any person has, I guess, a discretionary spend that they're going to spend on cycling. And I personally think it's a lot more fun to be able to buy cool new stuff that you might be coveting, be it that new set of glasses for trail, or that new helmet that looks really whiz-bang, that new cool set of kicks, new cycling kit, great new better performing winter jacket or other layers, new cool bling bits like you may have seen on the other video, like the awesome Ingrid cranks that I got for the Aspero, or I recently got some other Garmin Rally power meter pedals for one of my mountain bikes. That stuff's much more fun to buy as opposed to or a large percentage of your discretionary spend going on replacing your drivetrain components that could have lasted 2, 3, 5 times or more longer by making a great lubricant choice for your cycling as opposed to a really not so great lubricant choice for your cycling. So it's just, to me, it's just so money wasteful and so just overall, wasteful to be burning through drivetrain components at a much greater rate, multiple factor, greater rate for something as simple as your lubricant choice. Just knowing what is a genuinely proven top lubricant choice and run with one of those, as opposed to a random choice that you don't know, or if you can see a lubricant option on the table that's tested really poorly, just think, okay, what is that actually doing? So an area that's going to take me, I probably will never fix it before I retire, but in general, cyclists are really bad at tracking wear rates, accurately at least. So it's either not done or it's done not that accurately. So to do it well, you need an accurate chain wear checker and sort of a little bit of knowledge how to use it. So I've got a video on that in an earlier episode. And it also obviously helps to track the kilometres that you've travelled, so you know how many kilometres that they have done. So what's quite common, so we see all the time, there are a lot of, say, really, really terrible tested lubricants on the list that are going to be pretty sort of household name and well-known lubricants that probably a lot of people, a lot of cyclists or your cycling friends are using and buying, and delivering them really terrible drivetrain lifespans. And why don't they, I guess, realize that? Why don't they switch to something better? And the thing is, they just really, they don't know. Number one, they have no idea what the wear rate was delivered and what does that even mean? How does that compare? They've got no clue. If they just ride X lubricant and drivetrain for a year and then take it to a bike store, the bike store says it's worn and they need to replace everything, that's just situation normal, and away we go. So they don't know that when they took it in, that the chain might have been at 1.5% wear, which would be horrifically high friction with all this terrible lube running on it, and their cassette was completely chewed out, and they've done all this damage to their chain rings that may or may not need replacing as well. It's just kind of like, that's just sort of how it is. And so, the fact that they could have, if they were on a good lubricant choice, had basically, depending on how many Ks they do in that year, had a perfectly fine drivetrain to keep on going for another year, they don't tweak to that or realise. Or a lot of times as well, if they are actually measuring, they might measure their chain wear. They may have some idea as to how many kilometres it went, but sometimes it's like, I've done 6 months on it, or I've done 12 months on it, and it's at 1% or 0.75%, or whichever it may be, so I should replace it, and that's normal. And again, a lot of the times it's like you could have got so much more out of it on a top lubricant choice versus that, but they just think that, well, the marketing on this lubricant says it's all these fantastic, wonderful things. I'm sure it's doing all those fantastic, wonderful things it's telling me on the bottle or on the website. So had I gone with something else, no doubt it would be even worse than what I'm seeing here. So, but there's just no objectivity to it or no comparison. Real world riding has so many variabilities in it anyway, because there's no, if you're trying to compare one thing to another or one lubricant to another in real world riding, it's quite difficult anyway, because you've got variable, obviously, load and what's happening with the contamination. You've got sometimes contamination introduced very early into a chain's life from a wet ride that's hit early and no maintenance done, or maybe there's a long stretch of just great conditions before anything happens and things go less badly for longer before the high contamination wear starts to come in. So that really affects quite a lot the end of lifespan for the chain, and obviously the wear on the drivetrain. And so factoring in seasons and things like that, so you generally obviously get vastly higher drivetrain wear and chain wear through wet winter months if you're cycling all the time versus the same cyclist doing the same Ks in summer. And there's crossover periods. So when's it installed and what seasons and weather has it seen and what maintenance have you or have you not done and when did you do it, all play a pretty big role. And so real world testing, you do get some really big variances in your chain wear life. And so it's really hard to get an accurate ballpark for one lubricant versus another. And that's where I hope really that people will just sort of place some faith in the control testing that we do with zero friction cycling, which takes all those variabilities out of it. They're all seeing the same load, the same rate of contamination at the same spots. And this is a true benchmark of performance of one lubricant versus another through those conditions. So, my modelling costs definitely may not be unlikely to mirror what you're going to see for your particular riding, because you're not riding to my test, and my test is not designed to mimic anyone in particular's real world riding condition, because that's impossible. What it is it's a controlled benchmark so that we can see that this versus another, these are going to perform comparative to each other like this, and that's something that you can take away and use for your decision making. So I hope I explained that sort of okay. We'll go to now to cost to run based on just wear rates from a dry contamination test block. So, and this is using GRX 810 as the group set cost base. And so this one, as opposed to the first two data tables that I put up, where we are looking at the wear rate costs being extrapolated from the test results covering blocks 1 through to block 5. In this one here, because this is focused at dry off-road riding, the costs have been extrapolated purely from the lubricant's performance in block 2, which is the dry contamination block. So for some lubricants that will have dropped versus the block 1 to 5, because they may have, for instance, been quite negatively impacted in the wet contamination block, which kicks the wear rates overall up for that block 1 to 5 data. Whereas if they have really high dry dust contamination resistance, like a lot of the wax lubricants do, their cost to run in this table may actually be lower than in the other graphs. Whereas some lubricants will be really negatively affected because they just had really quite poor dust contamination resistance, because, say, for instance, they're a wet lubricant, so their cost to run is going to be comparatively worse versus the first two tables. And so, again, you can see, so once we start talking about off-road, and this will be a little bit of a follow-on from the last episode on what's the right lubricant choice for you. So if you are riding in off-road conditions, we have in the top spots, we have wax lubricant, immersive wax, wax lubricant, immersive wax, wax lubricant. We've got a wet lubricant that is actually a wet wax lubricant. Then we've got another wax lubricant, a wax lubricant, then a wet. So the first true, I guess, sort of wet lubricant is a fair way down there in Silka Synergetic. All the other top spots are taken by a wax or wax-based lubricant. So that's a pretty clear indication, I think, that to date, obviously, simply that lubricant base type has proven to be vastly superior in its dust contamination resistance versus something that is wet and has every particle of dust stick on contact and become part of the lubricant. And again, the more wet the lubricant, the worse that is, and the greater the pathway the dust contamination has to move from outside to inside the chain. The more wet, the more grinding paste that lubricant will become much more quickly. And that has just been proven time and time again. I hope if you've been watching any of the stuff that we've just proven that beyond any doubt. So if you're if you were not yet convinced, I guess, of that wet lubricants shouldn't be your option for off-road riding, just again have a look at that information, have a look at the cost to run, and again just consider. Now, again, there's going to be a lot of wet lubricants. I've kind of tested more wax lubricants than wet lubricants because one, that's been more of what the product is with the manufacturers who have booked in testing with me to independently benchmark their lubricant versus others on the market. Two, also a big focus obviously of Zero Friction Cycling has been to find the genuine best options for cyclists to be able to use to have a low friction drivetrain, more so than going out there to prove that other lubricant products are terrible. That's not the main focus of what I'm doing. So so more have been tested as opposed to the wet lubricants. So over time, I hope to test more wet lubricants, and we'll see if we find more that are not terrible. Like Black Diamond was something that officially it's a wet lubricant, but that tested really well. But overall, there are a lot of wet lubricants that are marketed specifically to the off-road market, so the mountain bike market or the gravel market. And they all make the same kind of claims, and I can only say that, based on testing, and based on they make a lot of the same claims about, they clean as they lubricate and, high pressure film strengths and all that sort of stuff. But if it's wet, it does not. It does not clean as it lubricates. Please, if there's one thing you're going to trust me on, trust me that a wet lubricant does not actively clean as it lubricates. The wet lubricant is actively attracting contamination as it lubricates and turning itself into a grinding paste. And the wetter it is, the worse that is. So if you are using a wet lubricant and you're riding off-road, you've just got tons and tons of money to save by not doing that and choosing something from the top third of the data table. And just on that point, I was going to cover it before, so the one thing that drives me a bit nuts is, and I really hate to seem like I'm just always picking on this company, but the UV light that Muc-Off include with a number of their wet lubricants to ensure that all of the outside of your chain is covered in a wet lubricant, it's just incredulously stupid. And it annoys me so much because whilst I don't expect that the vast majority of cyclists out there are going to twig that it's really stupid, because they're going to think, that looks cool, it's being sold to me as something being cool, the guy at the bike store tells me that it's cool and really groovy, so yeah, it must be really make sense, I should make sure that my chain's properly lubricated. That's perfectly normal for the average person. It doesn't matter, if you're a rocket scientist or a neurosurgeon, you don't spend your time thinking about this, you're going to accept that, okay, cool, that makes sense. But if you, I guess, focus on this area, it pretty quickly makes, it pretty quickly realize it's terrible, because you need lubrication inside the chain. The last thing you need is more wet lubricant sitting on the outside of your chain, because that just attracts so much more contamination, and you've got just that greater pathway for that to then get in the chain. So, yeah. What annoys me is when we have sort of cycling media that have reviewed these lubricants and they've actually highlighted it as a key benefit or feature that they have the UV light, so that you can make sure that the chain is coated on the outside in a wet lubricant. I firmly believe that muck off people that develop the lubricant and develop the light to go with the lubricant, because obviously they had to make the decision to infuse UV particles so that the UV light has something to highlight. It is impossible to me for anyone working in the lubricant space not to know that making sure that all of the outside of your chain is covered in a wet lubricant, that is going to be a horrendous idea. They would know that, and yet for marketing purposes still made the decision to I guess send people down that path. So it just really annoys me, and it really annoys me when media I guess positively highlight that, because it's a horrendous thing to do. Don't do it. Don't run a wet lube off-road if you can. And please, skip past all the marketing for wet lubes specifically marketed at off-road cycling. It is, I can tell you, not going to be true. And if a manufacturer disagrees, then please email me and we can talk about trying to test your lubricant through that dry contamination block, and we'll see. If you're willing to put the lubricant up and have that really publicly shown, then we'll see. If I'm wrong, I would love to be proven wrong. All right, so hopefully I've got that across. Wet lubricants, off-road, no. All right, so now if we go to, we'll put the next data chart up, which is so very similar to the previous one. So this is based only on a single block, which is block 4, which is the wet contamination test. Again, using GRX810, because I'm kind of assuming that this is for sort of wet off-road riding. Wet road riding, your wear rates will hopefully not be as bad. And so, this is really where we see that if you've got really high wear rates, it really adds up. So we've got at the top there, we've got M-Speed Wax New Formula and Silka Hot Melt. And again, so the immersive waxing in these harsh conditions, so the fact that immersive waxing resets the contamination in between each, every time you re-wax. And in wet cycling in particular, the water is bringing that contamination deep inside the chain. That ability to just reset the contamination as simply as a purpose of you performing what is effectively your re-lube just gives it a pretty unassailable advantage. So those two are in the lead by a fair bit. So throughout the testing, there is no cleaning. Throughout the main test and these test blocks, there is zero cleaning of the chain. It is all up to the lubricant to demonstrate how well it is able to do a lot of the things it claims, such as cleans it, lubes, and all that type of stuff. So once we get to the wet, we can start to see some pretty big differences start to appear, and we can start to see that, as opposed to in the dry block, where the dry contamination block was so clearly dominated by wax lubricants, we can actually see that we've got a couple of the top wet lubricants that have snuck in there. So Silka Synergetic in third spot, really shows what a great wet lubricant can sort of still manage to do in some really harsh wet conditions. The venerable Nix Friction, which has sort of been a long-term favourite for many. I'm actually replacing that now simply because some other wet lubricant products overall have tested better, such as Rex Black Diamond and Revolube. not specifically in just wet contamination test, but overall across the board, they just came out better. And they're just sort of going to be moving in to replace that now. But we can see that sticks on and does admirably well. Then we're back again to a number of the top wax lubricants tested as usual. But if you have a look down the bottom, things get really bad. Now you'll see a bunch of brackets there saying extrapolated data. What that means is that so a lot of the poorer lubricants tested, if a lubricant has reached the wear rate limit of the test by, say, the end of block 2 or by the end of block 3, so sometimes a lubricant done pretty poorly in block 2, but it hasn't used up all of its wear rate allowance. However, it hasn't really cleared out any of the contamination it gathered in block 2, and so it's continued a very high wear rate in block 3, and so by the end of block 3 it's reached the wear rate allowance. If the chain is done by the end of block 2 or block 3, like we already know it's a pretty terrible lubricant, and so it's not being put through block 4 because that's just things get really bad for for everything running a lubricant that's performing really poorly. The test machines just don't like it. It makes a hell of a noise. I get the worst once they start to perform quite poorly. I can get really bad chain suck when a lubricant's really done and just not handling because it's built up all this contamination. It's really abrasive, and so I have had before. I've tried push on tests where the chain suck gets so bad it's actually snapped the hanger off from, I guess, fatigue from all those bouncing cycles, and obviously the machine keeps running, so that gets pretty exciting for the test machine and couplings and chain stays and all that. So I don't push on that testing. Once if a lubricant's terrible, it's terrible. We know from the average though of the wear rates for the lubricants that do go through both block 2 and block 4 testing that the wear rate in block 4 the average is over double block 2, but I just use a doubling. So the extrapolated data is basically I have taken their block 2 result and doubled it to be what the expected result would be for that lubricant in block 4. And in all honesty, that is probably being quite kind to them. So if you think that the cost to run modelling looks nuts harsh, it is probably kind. And so you can see just, wow, the cost there. Like we're talking now, the top lubricants, the top 5, we're probably averaging a cost to run there of about $400. And the bottom 5, we're averaging, sort of somewhere closer to $3,000. Pretty big gap. And yeah, again, your drivetrain, your money, but I know what's more fun for me to spend my money on as opposed to burning through components. So, right, that'll probably do, or I'll ramble on for ages, but that's so a bit of an insight, into the cost to run modelling. If you hadn't seen it before, because it is still a little bit hidden, it is on the lubricant test page, but you need to click on the link to download the full file to get access to go to the Excel page that brings up this table. I do have more information about the modelling and how it's done on that page though, so if you want some more reading there. It's something that once I get a little bit more refined, and hopefully once we get to the stage where you can enter your own group set, so be it Axis Road or you might have XX1 Eagle, and you ride purely dry or you ride heaps in the wet, that you can enter those in. I will set it that you do have to do your own Googling to find the component cost, because I can't go really through and find all the component costs for all group sets and keep that up to date as things change over the years. So you'll have to enter the component cost for your cassette, chain rings, and chain. But once you've done that, then we'll be looking at getting the data table to bring up for all lubricants tested what the cost to run is going to be for your group set based on that. So that's going to be the next step. And when we get to that step, then I'm going to move this to basically be its own sort of standalone section on the website, so it's a lot more prominent, because this is really an area that I want to highlight a lot more, because I just really want to get the unnecessary early death of drivetrains from abrasion due to poor lubricant choice, even if it's might be overall a good lubricant, perhaps if you're riding dry road only, but it's a terrible lubricant choice if you're riding in off-road. Just really want to try to get that area going a whole lot better. And so this is the first sort of insight into that if you hadn't seen it before. and something that we're going to be a lot more focused on when I can find the time going forward to get that more and more refined. So I hope you found that of some interest, and fingers crossed. And if you did, please share it with all your friends so they can have a look and see what lubricant they're running and is it the right one for them. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and other YouTubey type things, like share with your friends. So that'll keep you up to date with the latest low friction news and hints and tips. And also put any comments down below, and I can try to look at those and take them into account for future episodes.